The note on the refrigerator listed 3 children. There were 2 children in that house. I had met them both, shaken both their small damp hands at the door, learned both their names in the first 30 seconds the way you do. Ren, who was 7 and who looked at my shoes instead of my face. Otto, who was 4 and who was already halfway up the stairs before his mother finished saying his name. And the note said, bedtime routine, all 3 down by 8. I stood in that kitchen with my coat still on and read it 4 times, and each time it said the same thing, and each time I found a slightly better reason for it to be nothing. My name is Adair. I was 29 that autumn, working 3 jobs and sleeping through the parts in between, and overnight childcare was the best of the 3 because you got paid to sit in a warm house doing very little while other people slept. I had an agency listing and good references and a first aid certificate that had cost me $200 and one very long Saturday, and I had been doing it for 2 years without incident. The house was called Marrowfield, which tells you something about the people who owned it. Out past the Ridge Road, past the point where the streetlights give up, down a private drive lined with limes that had been planted by somebody's great-grandfather in a straight line and had spent a century since going crooked. 3 stories of dark brick with a slate roof and windows that were taller than me. It had a name because it was old enough to have one, and it had a family in it because families are what old houses are for. The parents were Sabine and Theo Kestrand. She did something in restoration, textiles I think, and he did something in money that he described in a way designed to end the conversation. They were going to a wedding 2 hours away and staying over, back by noon on Sunday, and they were pleasant and rushed and they left in a cloud of perfume and car keys at 6:10 on a Friday evening in October with the light already going. At the door, with one arm in her coat, Sabine turned back and said, "Oh, and the notes are on the fridge." I said I'd seen them. And she said, "Good," and then she paused, half a second, no more, and said, "Don't worry about the 3rd one." Then she smiled and went out into the dark. I want to be honest about what happened next in my head, because I've had years to examine it. I did not think, that's sinister. I thought, there's a 3rd child at a grandparent's house, and the note is from a previous week, and she's telling me not to worry about it. That is a completely coherent reading of those words. It is, in fact, the obvious one. It held up for about 3 hours. The evening was good. I want to say that, because the good part matters. Ren showed me her rock collection, which lived in an egg carton and which she narrated with the terrible seriousness of a 7-year-old who has found her subject. Otto ate exactly the beige parts of his dinner. We watched half a film about a dog. The rain came in around 7:30, not hard, just steady, the kind that sets in for the night and turns a big house into a kind of ship. At 8 I took them up. The children's rooms were on the 2nd floor at the end of a corridor with a runner carpet and 3 doors on the left and 2 on the right. Ren's was the 2nd on the left. Otto's was the 3rd. And the first door on the left, the one nearest the stairs, was closed, and it had a small wooden letter on it at the height of a child's eye, hanging from a ribbon. The letter was AP. I noticed it the way you notice everything in someone else's house, which is to say I noticed it and moved on, and it was only later, sitting downstairs, that my mind went back and picked it up and turned it over. Ren went down easily. Otto did not, and we negotiated, and I won on a technicality involving a nightlight, and by 8:20 the corridor was quiet. At the top of the stairs I stopped and looked back at the closed door with the letter P. And I did a thing I have never been able to justify. I went and put my hand flat on it. It was warm. Not hot. Not like a radiator. Warm the way a door is warm when there is a lamp on behind it, or a person, or a small body under a duvet. And under my palm, through the wood, I could feel that the room was not empty of air the way an unused room is. There was a pressure to it. A held quality. I did not open the door. I've thought about that more than anything else. I did not open the door, and the reason was not fear, because I was not yet frightened. The reason was manners. It was somebody else's house and somebody else's closed door, and I had been told, gently and clearly, don't worry about the third one. So I went downstairs and made tea and sat in the kitchen with my laptop, and outside the rain kept on, and the house did what old houses do at night, which is to tell you it is bigger than you thought. At 20 to 11 the monitor picked up a voice. They had one of those parent units, an old model with a small screen and a hard plastic aerial, and it was set to sweep between the two children's rooms. Ren's room, 4 seconds, static. Otto's room, 4 seconds, static. I'd had it on the counter all evening as a kind of background noise, the way you do. And in the gap between the two, in the static, somebody said, "Are you there?" I want to describe this correctly. It was not a whisper. It was not distorted or growling or any of the things people expect. It was a child's voice, clear and ordinary, slightly bored, the way a child sounds when they've asked the same question several times already. "Are you there?" I picked the unit up. It swept. Ren's room, the sound of a 7-year-old breathing. Static. Otto's room, the small mechanical click of the nightlight. Static. "Are you there?" It came in the static, both times, in the interval, in the place where there was no room. I put the unit down on the counter very carefully, the way you put something down when your hands have stopped being reliable, and I stood in that kitchen and I thought about interference. Baby monitors pick up neighbors. Everyone knows that. Everyone has a story about it. Except the nearest house was 1.5 miles away, and it was a working farm with 2 men in their 60s in it. "Are you there?" said the static. And then, after a pause, in exactly the same tone, "I can wait." I went upstairs. I did not go with a plan. I went the way you walk into cold water, in stages, telling yourself you're only going to the corridor, only to the top of the stairs, only as far as the runner. The corridor was dark except for the strip of orange under Otto's door. Ren's door was ajar as she liked it. And the first door on the left, the one with the P, was open about 6 inches, and it had not been opened before, and there was no light in it at all. I stood at the top of the stairs for a long time. Then a voice from inside the room said, "Are you there?" And I said yes. I said it before I decided to. It came out of me the way an answer does when someone says your name. The voice said, "They told me your name. They tell me all of them." I asked who was in there. My own voice sounded wrong in that corridor, too loud and too high, and I heard it go down the stairwell and come back. And the voice said, "I'm Perrin. I'm the third one. I've replayed this 1,000 times and here's what I cannot get around." I was not, at that moment, afraid of a ghost. I was afraid of a child. Because everything in me was saying, there is a child in that room, a real one, and something is very wrong in this family, and the wrongness is not supernatural, it is the kind that involves police and social workers and a locked door on the 2nd floor. That's what I thought. I want that understood. I thought I had walked into a house where a child was being kept. So I pushed the door open. The room was a child's bedroom, and it was perfect, and it was empty. A single bed, made, with a blue cover. A shelf of books with their spines aligned. A wooden train on the floor, positioned at an angle, as though it had been left mid-play. A window with the curtain half drawn and the rain running down it. A lamp, off. A cup of water on the bedside table with the surface trembling very faintly, the way water does when something heavy has recently moved nearby. No child. No cupboard big enough. No underbed space, the frame went to the floor. Nothing. And it was warm. Properly warm, 10 degrees warmer than the corridor, and there was no radiator on. I checked, I put my hand on it was stone cold. Behind me, from the corridor, at about the height of my hip, parents said, "You're not supposed to come in." I did not turn around. That's the part I'm least proud of and most certain about. I did not turn around, and I stood there facing that empty bed with a child's voice at my hip, and I said, "Why not?" And Perrin said, "Because then you'll be one of the ones who knows, and the ones who know don't come back, and I like it better when they come back." I asked, and my voice was almost steady, "How long have you been here?" There was a pause. A considering one. And then Perrin said, "I don't know how long is. Mother says it's been a while." And then, in a smaller voice, the first thing that sounded like a real child rather than a recording of one, he said, "Are you going to be the one who stays till Sunday, or are you going to be one of the ones who leaves in the night? Because if you leave in the night, Ren cries in the morning and it's my fault." He said it lightly. That's what undid me. There was no menace in it at all, only the ordinary anxiety of a child who has been told he is difficult and has decided to believe it. I said, "I'm not going to leave." And he said, "That's what the one before you said," at about the same time, and she went out the back because the front sticks. I asked what her name was. He said, "I don't remember names very well anymore. I remember what they read. I stayed till Sunday. I want to tell you I did something brave or clever. I didn't. I went downstairs and I sat in the kitchen with all the lights on and I did not sleep and I did not call anyone, because what would I have said? And at 2 in the morning the monitor said, in the static, 'Thank you.' At about 4 he asked me if I would read something. He asked through the monitor, in the static between the rooms, very politely. And I said I couldn't come up, and he said that was all right, and could I just read it out loud where I was, because he could hear the kitchen. So I read to an empty kitchen for 40 minutes, out of a book of folk tales I found on the dresser, and the static did not interrupt once, and at the end of it a voice said, "That one's my favorite. Which one is your favorite?" And I said I didn't know yet, and he said, "That's all right, you can decide by Sunday." I should describe the rest of that night, because the shape of it is what made the 4 years afterward possible. Somewhere around 5 the rain stopped, and the silence that replaced it was worse, and I got up and walked the ground floor with the lights on because sitting still had become impossible. The kitchen. The dining room nobody used, with a table long enough for 12 and 8 chairs. A study with a wall of books and a photograph on the desk of 2 adults and 3 children on a beach, which I looked at for a long time before I understood what I was looking at, and then put face down, and then, ashamed, put back up. At 5:30 I said, out loud, to the ceiling, "Are you still there?" And after a moment, from the monitor on the counter, in the static, he said, "Yes." "Are you cold?" I said a little. He said, "The boiler is meant to come on at 6 but it doesn't unless you press the little button twice. Mother always forgets." I went and pressed the little button twice, and the radiator started ticking, and I sat down on the kitchen floor with my back against them and cried for about 10 minutes, which I had been putting off since 11. He didn't say anything the whole time. That was the kindest thing anybody did for me that year. At about 6 he said, "Is it light yet?" I said not quite. He said, "Tell me when." Sabine and Theo came back at 12 on Sunday. They came in with bags and wedding tiredness, and Sabine looked at my face in the hallway and stopped walking. She sent Theo up with the children. Then she stood in her own kitchen with her coat on and said, "You went in?" I said yes. She said, "I asked you not to." I said, "You said don't worry about it. You didn't say don't go in." And she closed her eyes for a moment and said, "No. I never say it properly. I've never once managed to say it properly." Then she made tea, which I found obscene at the time and understand better now, because you have to do something with your hands, and she told me. Perrin was there first. He was 6. There was an accident on the drive, in the winter, 11 years before, and it was nobody's fault in the way that these things are nobody's fault and everybody's fault forever. And he did not go. She said it exactly like that. He did not go. She said, for the first 2 years we thought it was us. Grief does that, it makes a house loud. And then Ren was born, and Ren started talking to him before she could talk to us properly, and he told her things she could not have known, and after that we stopped explaining it. I asked why they didn't move. And she looked at me like I had said something in a foreign language and said, "And leave him here?" They had a system. That's what got me. Not the ghost. The system. 11 years of a family arranging itself around a fact, with rules and workarounds and small daily kindnesses. His door stayed closed but not locked. His room stayed warm because he liked warm. They put the note on the fridge because Ren had insisted, at 5, that it was cruel not to, and they had never taken it off. They told sitters not to worry about the third one, and about half the sitters never noticed anything, and about half noticed something and did not come back, and 2, in 11 years, had gone into the room. I asked what happened to those 2. She said, "One moved to Lisbon. And the other one is standing in my kitchen." I sat for that family for 4 more years. That's the part people don't expect. I went back the following Friday, and the Friday after that, and it became a regular thing, and Perrin was, in the end, the easiest of the 3, because he never wanted anything except to be read to and to be told what was happening downstairs. He liked to know what I was cooking. He liked to be told the weather. Once, when Ren had a fever and I was up and down the stairs all night, the static said, "Is she all right?" over and over, until I sat on the corridor floor outside his door and told her temperature every 20 minutes until it broke. I never saw him. Not once, in 4 years. I felt the warmth of that room and I heard that flat, patient, slightly bored voice, and that was all, and after a while I stopped wanting more than that, and after a while longer I understood that not wanting more was itself a kind of caretaking. The Kestrans moved in the end. Theo's work, another country, and it was not a choice. I was there on the last night. Sabine asked me to be, and I understood why, and I did not make her say it. The house was almost empty by then. Boxes in the hall, pale rectangles on the walls where pictures had been. Ren was 11 and had cried for a week and was now in the flat, wrung-out calm that comes after. Otto was 8 and mostly excited about the plane. His room was the last one they packed, and they packed it on the last morning, and they left the bed made until the very end. At about 1 in the morning I sat on the corridor floor outside his door, the way I always did, and I said, "They're going tomorrow." And the voice said, "I know." I asked if he was going too. And there was a long pause, longer than any I'd had from him in 4 years, and then he said, "I don't think it works like that." I didn't know what to say. I still don't. I sat there in the dark of an empty corridor in a house that had a name, and eventually I said, "Would you like me to come back?" He said, "Would you?" I said yes. And he said, All right. Fridays. The new family moved in 8 months later. Perfectly nice people, a couple in their 40s with a golden retriever and no children at all, which I have decided to be glad about. I drove out there once, the following autumn, on a Friday, and I sat in my car at the top of the private drive under the crooked limes with the rain coming down, and I looked at the second floor, at the first window on the left, and the light was off, and the curtains were open, and there was nothing to see. I did not go to the door. What would I have said? So I sat there for about an hour with the engine off and the rain on the roof, and at some point I said, out loud, in an empty car, I'm here. I'm sorry it's not inside. I'm here though. And then I drove home. I've done that every autumn for 6 years now. Once a year, one Friday, an hour in a parked car on a private road. My partner knows. He thinks it's grief for something else, some displacement, and I've let him think that, because the true version requires too much of a person. But here's the thing I go for, the thing I've never told anyone. The first year, nothing. The second year, nothing. The third year, driving away, at the bottom of the drive, my radio came on by itself. Not tuned to anything. Just static, the flat wash of an empty band, and I pulled over and sat with my hands on the wheel and listened to it for about 90 seconds. And in it, so faint I have never been sure, so faint that I have built an entire private religion on about 4 seconds of noise, something said, which one's your favorite yet? I still haven't decided. I go back every year to tell him that. The boy did not sleepwalk. That's what I have to keep saying, because everybody wants him to have been sleepwalking, and he was not, and I was the one standing there. He walked to the front door at 12 minutes past 3, every night, and he stood in front of it with his hands at his sides, and when I said his name he turned around and looked at me with his eyes open and awake and entirely present, and he said, in a normal voice, "It's all right, I'm just seeing what he wants." His name was Casimir. He was 9. And I was the 4th sitter his mother had gone through that winter. I'm Rowena. I was 36, and I had been a pediatric nurse for 11 years before my back gave out on a night shift and made that impossible, and after that I did private care for children, mostly medical, sometimes not. I was expensive and I was worth it, and I had never once, in my career, been afraid of a child. The house was in a coastal town called Sallow Bay, which is beautiful in July and unspeakable in February. Off-season, the place empties by 90%. The holiday lets go dark. The one good restaurant closes. What's left is a few hundred year-rounders, a chip shop, a harbor full of boats sitting on mud at low tide, and a wind that comes off the water and does not stop, ever, for the entire winter, so that after about a week you stop hearing it and start feeling it in your teeth. The mother was called Marisol Vance. Widowed 18 months. She worked nights at a care home 2 towns over, for shifts a week, because that was the shift that paid, and she had a mortgage on a house her husband had chosen. She was 39 and looked older and apologized constantly for things that were not her fault. She interviewed me in her kitchen with the wind going at the window, and near the end she said, "I should tell you, Cass has a night thing." I said most children do. And she said, yes. But you should know that the other 3 all left, and I'd rather you knew before than after. I liked her enormously from that moment. The house was a Victorian semi on the road above the harbor, 3 floors, tall and narrow, the kind where the stairs eat half the building. Cass had the top floor to himself, a converted attic room with a sloped ceiling and a skylight and a view of the water that on clear nights was genuinely extraordinary, and on most nights was a rectangle of moving black. I moved in on a Sunday. For nights a week, in the house from 7 to 7, sleeping in the spare room on the middle floor when I could. The first 3 nights were unremarkable. He was a quiet, bright, watchful child who read above his level and drew endlessly and did not talk about his father. He went to bed at 8:30 and read until 9 and slept. On the 4th night, at 3:12, I woke because the stairs were creaking. I want to describe the sound of that house because it is the whole story. A tall narrow Victorian in a coastal wind is never still. The sash windows breathe. The chimney flue moans on a certain heading. The front door, which was old and heavy, had a gap at the bottom, and when the wind came from the northeast it would push under that door and up the stairwell, and the whole house would go slightly pressurized, and doors would shift in their frames all the way to the top. So there was always noise. That's the point. There was so much noise in that house that a boy coming down 3 flights of stairs was, in the ordinary run of things, indistinguishable from weather. I only woke because he stopped on the landing outside my door. I lay there. I heard him breathing. Then he went on down. I followed him, and I found him in the hall, standing about 2 feet back from the front door, facing it, arms at his sides, in blue pajamas with rockets on them, in the dark. I said his name. He turned around. Eyes open, focused, awake. And he said, "It's all right, I'm just seeing what he wants." I asked who. And Cass said, "The man who knocks." Nobody had knocked. I want to be clear. I had been awake since the stairs. There had been no knock. I asked him that. I said, "Cass, nobody knocked." And he looked at me with real patience, the patience children reserve for adults who are being slow, and he said, "He doesn't knock on the door. He knocks on the house." I took him back up. He went easily. He was asleep in 4 minutes and slept through till 7 and ate 2 bowls of cereal and went to school. I told Marisol. Of course I did. And she sat down at the kitchen table with her coat still on after a 12-hour shift and put her face in her hands and said, 3:12. I said yes. She said, "That's when they came to the door. The police. When Ned died. 3:12 in the morning, and they knocked, and I was asleep, and Cass came down before I did and he opened it." She said, "He was 7. He opened the door and there were 2 officers and he knew before anyone said anything." And then she said the thing that I have carried around for 9 years. She said, "So it isn't a ghost, is it? It's just that he answered the door once and now he can't stop." I agreed with her. For 11 days I agreed with her completely. Here's what changed my mind. It was not dramatic. There was no face at the window, no handprint, no voice on a recording. It was arithmetic. I started keeping a log, because that's what you do with a symptom. Time out of bed, time at the door, time back down, what he said, weather, wind direction. Nurse's habit. 11 nights of data. And on the 11th night I sat at the kitchen table with my notebook and I saw it. He was not always at the door at 3:12. He was at the door at 3:12 on the nights the wind came from the northeast. On the other nights, he came down at 3:12, and he went to a different place. Twice to the back door in the kitchen. Once to the window on the middle landing. Once, on a still night with no wind at all, he had not come down at all, and I had found him at 4 standing at the top of the attic stairs with his hand flat on the sloped ceiling, and he had said, "Sorry, it's the roof tonight." He was going to wherever the house was being pushed. That is a completely rational description of a child following a sound. A house under wind load creaks at the loaded face. A boy who is hypervigilant about knocking would, of course, orient toward whatever part of the structure was moving. I could write that up as a case note and any doctor in the country would nod. Except for one thing. On the still night. The night with no wind, the night I stood outside and there was absolutely nothing, the harbor flat as a plate and the flags dead on their poles. The roof was ticking. I went up onto the flat section over the back extension with a torch at 4:30 in the morning, and I stood there in the cold and the total stillness, and above me, on the main pitch, something was making a slow, spaced, deliberate sound on the slates. Tick. 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 Not fast. Not random. Spaced about a second and a half apart, absolutely even, going on for as long as I stood there, which was 6 minutes. There were no trees near that roof. There was no ice, it was 4 degrees. There were no birds. I sat there with the torch off and let my eyes go, and there was nothing on that pitch, nothing at all, just slate and sky and a moon behind cloud. I went down and Cass was still standing at the top of the attic stairs with his palm flat on the ceiling. I asked him what it wanted. I don't know why I asked that. I had spent 11 days building a careful clinical framework, and I threw it away in one sentence at 4:30 in the morning because I had heard something ticking on a roof. And Cass said, he never says. He just wants me to know he's out there. Then he said, it's better when I go and stand where he is. If I don't, he does it louder, and then Mum wakes up and cries. He'd been managing it. 9 years old, and he had worked out a protocol, and the protocol was, go to the loaded face, stand there, acknowledge it, go back to bed. He had been doing it for 18 months to keep his mother from waking. That's the horror. Not the ticking. That. I stayed 11 months. I could tell you what I tried. I tried everything. We had a structural survey, which found a house in reasonable condition for its age. We had the slates checked. We recorded, and got a lot of wind and, twice, something on the roof that the sound man said was probably a gull, and that lasted 40 minutes and was metronomic to within 1/10 of a second. We had a very good child psychologist in Truro who saw Cass 9 times and wrote a careful report using the words complicated grief and nocturnal ritual, and who, at the end of the 9th session, walked me out to the car park and said, off the record, does that house have something wrong with it? And I said yes. And she said, yes. All right. Then that's a different conversation, and I'm not qualified for it. What worked, in the end, was leaving. They moved in the November. Inland, a bungalow near Marisol's sister, nothing beautiful about it at all, no view of anything. I drove them. 2 cars, a rented van, a 9-year-old asleep against the window with a rucksack of drawings on his lap. And the first night in that bungalow, Cass slept until 7:30, and he did the same the second night, and the third, and by the end of the first month Marisol phoned me crying so hard I could not understand her for about a minute, and what she was saying was, he's just a boy. He's just a normal boy. He's 18 now. He's fine. Genuinely, actually fine, which is the rarest ending in my profession, and I do not take it lightly. He's at university studying something with computers that he has explained to me twice and I have not understood either time. Here's my last piece. 2 years ago I went back to Sallow Bay. Not for this. For a wedding, of all things, in July, when the town is beautiful and full and loud and nothing about it makes any sense with my memory. And on the Sunday morning I walked up the road above the harbor, and the house was there, and it had been painted a nice pale blue, and there were bicycles in the front garden and a child's paddling pool folded against the wall. A woman was cutting back a hedge. She said good morning. I said good morning, and I asked, because I could not stop myself, how long she had been there. She said 4 years. She said they loved it. She said the light was extraordinary. And then she straightened up with the shears in her hand and she said, "Actually, since you're a stranger and I'll never see you again, can I ask you something ridiculous?" And I said yes, and I already knew. She said, "Does that road get a lot of wind at night?" Because my daughter says there's a man on the roof, and I've been up there 4 times. I stood on that pavement in the July sun with a wedding hangover and a bag of pastries in my hand, and I thought about all the things I could say. The survey. The recordings. The 11 nights of data. The psychologist in the car park. And what I said was, "How old is she?" And the woman said, 9. I said, "Does she go and stand where the sound is?" The shears came down. She looked at me for a long moment and her face did something I recognized from 11 months in a house above a harbor. And she said, "How did you know that?" I said, "Because she's trying to keep it quiet so you can sleep. So don't be angry with her when you find her downstairs." Then I gave her my number, which she has never used, and I walked back down to the harbor and sat on the wall and looked at the boats. 9 years old. That's the part one can't put down. Twice, in the same house, 9 years old. And I have spent a long time telling myself that houses attract the same kinds of families, that coastal towns produce anxious children, that grief and wind and old slate will do this anyway. But sometimes, at 3 in the morning, in my own perfectly modern flat with its double glazing and its silence, I think about that ticking. Slow. Spaced. Even. Going on for as long as anyone will stand there and listen. Not trying to get in. That was never it. 18 months of a boy standing at doors and windows and under roof pitches, and never once did anything try to handle. It only ever wanted somebody to come and stand where it was. And somebody always does. That's what 9-year-olds are for, it turns out. They're the ones who still answer. I answered a phone once in 1978 and I have been listening to that call ever since. I was 16. I need you to understand what a 16-year-old sitter was in that year, in that place, because it isn't what it is now. There was no phone in your pocket. There was one phone in the house, on the wall in the kitchen, with a cord long enough to reach the hallway and no further. There was no way of checking anything, or telling anyone, or looking anything up. When you were in a house at night with somebody's children, you were in it, entirely, and the only door out was a car you could not drive and a road you would not walk. My name is Verity. I am 64 now, and I have told this story perhaps 6 times in my life, and every time I tell it, it changes shape, and I have stopped pretending that isn't happening. The family was the Dowds, on Cynic Lane, at the edge of a town called Harrogate Bell, which has since been swallowed by a bypass in a retail park and does not really exist anymore. A brick semi with a long back garden that gave onto a field, and past the field, nothing, for a mile, until the reservoir. There was one child, a girl called Nessa, who was 4 and who slept like a stone. Mr. and Mrs. Dowd went to a dance at the rugby club every second Saturday. They paid me £1.20 an hour, which was good, and Mrs. Dowd always left a plate of sandwiches under a cloth, which was better. That night it was the 14th of October and it was foggy. Proper fog. The sort that comes up out of low fields in autumn and puts a wall 4 feet from the window. You could not see the end of the back garden. You could not see the streetlight at the corner, only a slight warm bruise in the air where it should have been. Nessa went down at 7. I did my homework at the kitchen table until 8:30 and then I watched television with the sound low. At 9:10 the phone rang. I answered it the way we all did, by reciting the number, and a man's voice said, "Is that the Dowd's house?" I said it was. And he said, Are you the girl who's minding the child? Now, here is where I have to be very careful, because every version of this story that has ever been told, and I have heard them all, has a man on the phone saying something clever and frightening. And that is not what happened. What happened is that he sounded worried. He said, "Love, I don't want to alarm you. My name's Franco Vet. I live at the back, on Callow Road. My garden backs onto that field. There's a man in the field." I said, "In the field?" He said, "He's been there about 20 minutes. He's just standing. I can only see him because he's between me and the light off your kitchen. I phoned the police and they're coming, but they said it might be an hour because of the fog." And then he said, "Have you got the back door locked?" I had not. I put the phone down on the counter and I went and locked the back door, and I remember my hands did it perfectly well, no shaking, and I remember thinking that was strange, and then I picked the phone up and said, "Yes." He said, "Good girl. Now the front." I locked the front. He said, "Are the curtains shut?" They were, downstairs. Not the kitchen. The kitchen had a blind that had been broken since the summer and hung at an angle. He said, "Right, well, don't stand in the kitchen then." We stayed on the phone for 2 hours and 11 minutes. I know because Mrs. Dowd got the bill and asked me about it, later, when everything else had happened. He was very calm. He talked to me about ordinary things. He asked what I was studying and I said history and English, and he said history was the useful one. He told me about his allotment. He told me his wife had died in the spring and that he had got into the habit of sitting up at the back window because the bed was too big, and that this was the only reason he had seen anything at all. Every so often he would go quiet for a moment and then say, "Still there." Or, "He's moved a bit, he's nearer the fence now." At about 11:15 he said, "He's at the fence." At 11 he said, "He's in the garden." And I said, "What do I do?" And Franco Vet said, "You go upstairs, love, and you get in with the little one, and you shut the door and you put something against it, and you don't come out for anybody but the police or the parents, and I'm going to stay right here and I'm not going anywhere." The phone would not reach upstairs. I said that. And he said, "I know. That's all right. You go." And I said, "But then I can't hear you." And he said, "I'll still be here." I went up. I got into the small bed with Nessa, who did not wake, and I pulled her chest of drawers across the door, which took a long time and made a noise I was certain could be heard from the field. And then I lay there in the dark of a 4-year-old's bedroom in the fog, and I listened to somebody try the back door handle. Slowly. Down and up. Then again. Then the kitchen window, the one with the broken blind, a sort of testing rattle in the frame, 3 times. Then nothing for what I have always believed was about 40 minutes and was probably 12. Then the police, and blue light coming through the curtains and turning the whole room the color of a swimming pool, and a woman officer's voice on the landing saying, "Sweetheart, it's all right, you can open the door now." I want to describe those 40 minutes properly, because they are the only part of my life I can still enter at will. The room smelled of a 4-year-old, which is a particular smell, warm and slightly sweet and faintly of soap. There was a nightlight shaped like a mushroom that threw a red circle on the ceiling. Nessa slept on her front with one arm hanging off the edge of the bed, and I lay behind her with my face about 4 inches from the back of her head, and I did the only useful thing available to me, which was to count her breaths. I got to something over 1100. And what I remember, more clearly than the handle or the window, is the strangeness of the arithmetic I was doing. I was 16 and I was working out where I would put her. Not what I would do. Where I would put her. Under the bed if there was room, which there wasn't. Behind the door. Out of the window onto the flat roof over the kitchen, which I had noticed earlier that evening for no reason at all and which had lodged in me and was now the most important fact I possessed. That is what nobody prepares you for. You do not spend those minutes frightened. You spend them planning, coldly and in detail, and afterward you have to live with knowing that you were capable of it at 16, and with never finding out whether the plan was any good. At some point I heard the letterbox. Just once. The flap lifted and let down, gently, the way the postman does it when he doesn't want to wake you. And I thought, quite clearly, he's looking at the hall. They caught him in the field. He had a bag with him. I was never told what was in the bag and I have never once wanted to know. He went to prison and I did not have to give evidence in person because of my age, and my mother threw away the local paper for about a month, and by the following spring people had mostly stopped mentioning it. That's the story. That's the whole of the frightening part, and it isn't why I still think about it. 2 weeks after, my father drove me round to Callow Row with a bottle of sherry and a card, because that is what my parents' generation did, and I stood on the step of a small brick bungalow while my father knocked. A woman answered. 50s, cardigan, reading glasses on a chain. My father said we'd come to thank Mr. Ovett. And she said, who? I said, Frank Ovett. He lives here. And she said, this is my house. I've lived here 11 years. There's no Ovett on this road, I'd know, I do the church rota. My father was not a man who gave up on a task. We went to 4 more houses on Callow Row that afternoon. Nobody had heard the name. My father, God bless him, went to the police station on the Monday and asked, and a very tired sergeant checked, and the emergency call that brought them out to St. Nick Lane that night came from a phone box on the Harrogate Bell Ring Road at 8 minutes to 9. 8 minutes to 9. 18 minutes before my phone rang. There is no phone box on the Ring Road that you could see the Dowds back field from. There is no phone box within a mile of it. It is on the other side of the town. And the call to me lasted 2 hours and 11 minutes, which you cannot do from a coin box in 1978. You could not do it from a coin box in 1978 if you had a sack full of tenpences and nothing else to do with your evening. So a man who did not live where he said he lived, and could not see what he described, phoned the police from across town before he phoned me, and then talked to a 16-year-old girl for 2 hours and 11 minutes about his allotment and his dead wife while telling her, in real time and with complete accuracy, the position of a man in a field he could not possibly have been watching. I have had 48 years with this. I have gone through all of the explanations, and I want to give you the best one, because I think it's important to be fair. The best explanation is that Frank Ovett was a real man who gave a false name and a false address because he had a reason to, that he was somewhere he should not have been that night, and that he did the decent thing anyway and then made himself unfindable. That is a good explanation. It covers almost everything. It does not cover the phone bill. 2 hours and 11 minutes on the Dowd's line from a number that the exchange, when Mrs. Dowd queried it, listed as unallocated. And it does not cover the last thing. 22 years later, in the year 2000, I was 38 and I was clearing my mother's house after she died, and in the bottom of a box of my father's papers I found the card. The one we had taken round. The thank you card with the sherry, that we had brought home again because there was no one to give it to. My father had kept it, unsent, for 22 years, and I sat down on the floor of that house with it in my hands. It was still sealed. My mother's handwriting on the front. Mr. F. Ovett. I opened it. Inside, under my mother's message and my father's signature and my own careful 16-year-old thank you, on the blank left-hand page, in pencil, in a hand I have never seen before or since, someone had written 11 words. It said, "You did everything right. Go to sleep now. It's over." I want to tell you what I did with that card, and the answer is nothing. It's in a drawer. I look at it perhaps once every 2 years. I've had it examined, in a mild way. A friend who does documents said the pencil was consistent with the period and that it could have been written at any time. That's the most anyone can say. Here's what I've come to, in my 60s, and you can do what you like with it. I do not think a ghost saved me. I don't have the machinery for that. What I think is stranger and quieter, and I have never been able to say it well. I think that for 2 hours and 11 minutes on the 14th of October 1978, in a foggy house at the edge of a town that doesn't exist anymore, somebody sat with me. And I think that whatever that was, it understood something that none of the adults in my life understood, which is that the danger was never the thing in the field. The danger was the 2 hours. The danger was being 16 and alone in the dark with a sleeping child and a broken blind and no one to tell, and having to be the adult in that house with absolutely nothing to draw on. That's what breaks people. Not the man. The waiting. And something came and sat with me through it, and talked about allotments, and said still there, so that I would not have to hold the whole of it by myself. I have babysat, mothered, and now grandmothered. I have sat up with a great many frightened people. And every single time, without fail, I hear myself doing it. The calm voice. The ordinary questions. The unnecessary detail about nothing at all, offered up to fill the silence so the silence can't do its work. I'll still be here. That's the line I use. I didn't choose it. It arrived to me at 16 through a telephone from a man who does not exist, and I have been handing it on for 48 years, and I expect I will be doing it on the last night of my life. Somebody has to say it. It turns out it hardly matters who. In 4 weeks the baby did not cry once. Not when she was hungry. Not when she was wet. Not at 2 in the morning when I lifted her out of the cot with cold hands and she came up out of sleep and her eyes opened and found me in the dark. Not ever. For weeks, 22 nights, and the only sounds that child made were breathing and swallowing and, occasionally, a small considering noise in the back of her throat, like someone reading a difficult sentence twice. I have worked as a night nurse for infants for 19 years. I have been in something over 400 houses. I want you to understand that a newborn who does not cry is not a blessing. It is a symptom. It is the first thing we are trained to be frightened of. My name is Anselm. I am 51, I trained in Rotterdam and have worked in 3 countries, and I am the person wealthy people hire when they want to sleep. That is the whole job, described honestly. They pay me a great deal of money to take the nights so that they can be pleasant to each other in the mornings. The house was in a development called Thornmere Reach, which was 11 houses on a former estate, each on 2 acres, each with a gate and an intercom and a great deal of glass. It was 30 minutes from the city and it felt like it was 30 minutes from anything. There were no pavements. Nobody walked anywhere. At night you could stand in the road, in the middle of the road, and there would be no car and no dog and no window lit, and the only sound would be the security lights of a house half a mile away clicking on for a fox and clicking off again. The family was called Ashgrove. Delphine and Callum. She was 34 and had been a dancer until an injury and now did something with a foundation. He was 46 and did something I never established and was away 4 nights in 5. And the baby was Iris. 9 weeks old when I started. The first interview was with Delphine alone, in a living room with a window 20 feet high, and she was composed and gracious and asked all the right questions, and at the end of it she said, I should say. She's very quiet. I said, quiet how? And she said, she doesn't cry. And then she laughed, a small, correct, hostess laugh, and said, everyone tells me how lucky I am. I asked whether the pediatrician had seen her. She said, 3 of them. That was the moment I took the job. Not despite that answer. Because of it. 3 pediatricians means a mother who is not being told what she needs to hear, and in my experience that mother is usually right about something. The medical picture was clean. I saw the notes. Vocal cords normal, hearing normal, tone normal, weight tracking beautifully along the 50th. She smiled at 6 weeks, socially, on time. She tracked faces. She startled to sound, which is the important one, because a baby who does not startle is a baby with a hearing problem, and that is a solvable thing, and I would have been glad of it. She startled. She simply did not cry about it. The first week I documented everything. Nurse's habit. Feeds, weights, times, and a column I made up for myself called vocalization, which stayed empty. The second week I started using the monitor differently. They had a very expensive system, a camera over the cot with night vision and a microphone sensitive enough to pick up my own footsteps from the doorway, and it recorded continuously to an app. I began reviewing the footage in the daytime, at home, in my own flat, at double speed, with headphones. 4 hours a day, on top of the nights. My wife thought I had lost my sense of proportion, and she may have been right, and she also, I want to record, never once told me to stop. On the 11th night I found the lullaby. 3:51 in the morning. I was downstairs, in the kitchen, sterilizing. And in the nursery, over the cot, the microphone picked up singing. A woman's voice, close to the mic, close to the child. Not loud. A tune I did not know, 4 or 5 notes going round, in a language I could not identify and have since been told by 2 separate people is not a language. It went on for 2 minutes and 40 seconds. And on the video, the room is empty. The cot is there, the baby is there on her back with her arms up beside her head the way they do, and there is nobody in that room, and the baby's eyes are open, and she is looking up and slightly to the left at nothing, and she is calm, and she is listening. I did not tell Delphine. Not that night, not that week. I want to be honest about my reasoning, and it was not brave. I told myself the microphone had picked up a radio, a neighbor, an app on a phone, a smart speaker in another room. Every one of those is a real thing that really happens. So I tested them. All of them, systematically, over 9 nights. I unplugged the speakers. I turned off every device in the house. I sat in the nursery myself with a second recorder and my own ears. And on the 20th night, sitting in a chair 3 feet from that cot at 4 in the morning, in the dark, wide awake, I heard it. Not in my head. Not a suggestion. A woman singing, quietly, from a point in the air about 18 inches above the baby's face, and I could feel where it was in the room the way you can feel where a person is standing behind you. I did not move. I sat in that chair and I listened to the whole of it, 2.5 minutes, and Iris lay there with her eyes open and her small hands loose, and at the end of it the singing stopped mid-phrase, not at the end of the tune, and there was a sensation I can only describe as the room having one less thing in it. Then Iris turned her head toward me. 9-week-old babies do not look at you like that. I have held 400 of them. She looked at me for a long moment with complete attention, and then she made that small considering noise in her throat, twice, and went to sleep. I sat in that chair until 5:30, which is the hour I know better than any other, the hour when a house is at its coldest and a person is at their least defended. Outside the enormous window the 2 acres of garden were entirely black, and then gradually not black, and I watched the shapes of things arrive out of it one at a time. A hedge. A stone urn. A tree that had been a person for about 4 minutes. And I did what I always do on nights that have gone wrong, which is to go through my training in order, like a rosary. Airway. Breathing. Color. Temperature. Feeding history. It is not that any of it applies. It is that the sequence is a handrail and I have held it in 400 houses. At the end of it I was left with the only clinical observation I could actually defend, and it was this. The child was thriving. Weight, tone, alertness, social response, all of it textbook or better. Whatever was in that room at 4 in the morning, it was not harming her body. That is the sentence I put in my notes, and I have looked at it many times since, and I notice now what I did not notice then. I wrote body. I was already, at 5:30 on the 20th night, being careful about what I was and was not claiming. The next morning I told Delphine. I did it badly. I had rehearsed it in the car and every version I had prepared involved words like anomaly and artifact, and what actually came out of my mouth in that enormous kitchen was, "Does anyone sing to her?" She was pouring coffee. She stopped. She said, "You've heard it." And then she sat down on the floor. Not on a chair. On the floor of her own kitchen, with her back against a cabinet, and she put her hands over her face, and she said, "Oh thank God, oh thank God, I thought I was going mad, Callum thinks I'm going mad, they gave me tablets." She had been hearing it since the second week. She had told her husband, and her mother, and a doctor, and each of them had done the arithmetic that everyone does, which is, new mother, no sleep, hearing singing. She had been on medication for 11 weeks for a symptom that was in the room. We sat on that kitchen floor together for a long time, a 51-year-old Dutch night nurse and a 34-year-old woman in a dressing gown, and she told me the rest. Iris was not there first. There had been a boy, 2 years before. He was born at 31 weeks and he lived for 9 days in an incubator in a unit an hour away, and then he did not. His name was Emmerich. And Delphine said, I sang to him. Every night for 9 nights. Through the port in the side of the box, with my hand in there, because you can't hold them, and the nurse said talk to him, they know your voice, so I sang. I asked what she sang. And she said, nothing. Nonsense. I don't know any lullabies, I never learned any, so I just made something up on the first night and then I had to keep singing the same thing because it was his. I asked her to sing it. She did. 4 or 5 notes, going round. Not a language. I do not know what to tell you about what that was. I am a practical man from a practical profession and I have spent 9 years not saying this out loud in any room where I might be quoted. What I believe, on the balance of what I saw, is this. Something was in that house singing a song that had been invented in a hospital and had existed in the world for 9 nights and had never been written down or recorded or heard by anyone except one dying baby and his mother. And whatever it was doing the only thing it knew how to do, to the only child that was there. Now I have to tell you the difficult part, because a story like this wants to end warmly and this one does not, quite. I said earlier that a baby who does not cry is a symptom. Here is why. A baby cries to summon. That is the entire function. It is not distress, exactly. It is a call, and it exists because a human infant that cannot summon an adult dies. It is the first and most important thing they do, and they do it within seconds of being born, and every single one of them does it without being taught. Iris did not, because Iris never needed to. She was never, in the whole of her short life so far, alone. Every time she woke in the dark, before the discomfort could rise to the level of a call, something was already there, 18 inches above her face, singing. Do you see what that means? She had never once experienced the gap. The interval between needing and being answered. And it is in that gap that a person learns that they are separate, that the world is not automatic, that you must reach. She had never reached. I explained this to Delphine over about 6 weeks, in pieces, gently, and she understood it faster than I did, because mothers do. And then she asked me the question I had been dreading, which was, so what do we do? And I said, you have to make her cry. We moved her out of that nursery, into a room on the other side of the house, and the singing followed her within 4 nights. We took her to Delphine's mother's for a week and there was nothing, 7 clean nights, and on the 8th night back at Thornmere Reach it was there again at 4:10. So in the end they sold the house. It took 5 months. Iris was 8 months old when they left, and by then she had begun to make sounds, real ones, babble and shriek and the beginnings of protest, but she still did not cry properly, not the full summoning cry, and Delphine had stopped finding that adorable and started finding it unbearable, which was the correct development. The new house was in a town, on a street, with neighbors on both sides. The first night in it, at about 2:30, Iris woke and there was nothing above her and no one came for 9 seconds. And she cried. Delphine phoned me at 2:50 in the morning to tell me. 19 years in this work and that is the only time a parent has ever phoned me in the night to celebrate. Iris is 9 now. I get a card at Christmas. She is loud, apparently. Aggressively loud. Delphine's word. Here's the last of it, and I have thought very carefully about whether to include it, and I have decided that leaving it out would make this a nicer story than it is. When they sold Thornmere Reach, they sold it to a couple with no children. Delphine was clear about that, she waited 2 extra months and took less money to make it so. I want her credited with that. She did the responsible thing at real cost. 6 years later that couple had a daughter. I know because Delphine found out, the way you do, and she phoned me, and she was very calm and very frightened and she said, do I have to tell them? What do I even say? And I said, I don't know. She didn't tell them. I want to be honest about that too. She thought about it for 3 weeks and she did not, and I did not push her, and I have my own reasons which are not good ones. Because here is the thing that stops me, every time, at 4 in the morning in my own house. It never hurt Iris. It never once hurt her. For 9 months something sat above that cot in the dark and sang the only song it had, and the harm it did was the harm of too much care, of being answered before you can ask, of never in your life being permitted to be alone for 9 seconds. That is a real harm. I stand by everything I did. But when I think about Emmerich, who was born too early and lived 9 days in a plastic box and was sung to through a hole in the side of it by a woman who did not know any lullabies and had to invent one, and when I think about whatever it was in that house going patiently round and round the same 4 notes at 4:10 in the morning to a child it had never met, in a room it did not belong in, for 9 months, and asking nothing at all in return. I do not know what to call that. I know what it isn't. It isn't a haunting. A haunting is something that wants. That thing didn't want. That thing was doing a job, in the dark, while everybody slept, exactly the way I do. And some nights, in the houses I work in now, when it's 4:15 and the feed is done and the child is under my hand and going down, I catch myself humming. I don't know where I got it. I've never asked Delphine to sing it again. I would rather not find out that they're the same 4 notes. The app said the family was called Bramwell and had a 5-star rating from 41 sitters, and every single one of those reviews was written in the same rhythm. I did not notice that at the time. I want to be clear that I noticed it later, at 3 in the morning, on the floor of a bathroom, and that noticing it then was not useful to me at all. My name is Juno. I was 26, I had a degree in art history and $11,000 in debt and a flat share with a boy who left hair in the sink, and I made most of my money on one of those apps where families and sitters find each other and the company takes 20% and calls itself a community. I was good on that app. That sounds like nothing. It was, at the time, the only thing in my life I was measurably good at. I had 160 jobs and a 4.98, and I had learned exactly how to write a message to a stranger about their children. The Bramwell booking came in on a Tuesday for the following Saturday. Overnight, 8 until 8, 2 children aged 6 and 3, a house 40 minutes out on the Kell Road. The rate was 2.5 times what I usually got. The message was warm and slightly over-explained, the way nervous parents write. It mentioned the app's own safety guarantee twice. It had one small typo, which I remember thinking was reassuring, because scams don't have typos, scams are too careful. I accepted it in about 4 minutes. Here is what I did as due diligence, and I want it listed, because I did more than most people would and it did not help. I read the profile. I read 11 of the 41 reviews. I checked that the account was ID verified, and it was, with the little green badge. I sent the address to my flatmate and my sister. I looked the address up on a Maps app and I saw a house, from the road, in daylight, in an image dated the previous spring, and it was a perfectly ordinary large detached house with a hedge. Every one of those checks passed. That's the whole point of what I'm telling you. The Kell Road at 8 in the evening in February is 40 minutes of nothing. Dual carriageway, then B road, then a stretch with no lighting at all where the hedges come up close on both sides and your headlights are the only thing in the world. There was a fine rain that was not quite rain, more a suspension, the kind that sits on the windscreen without ever running. The house was set back behind that hedge with a gravel turning circle. Lights on in 3 downstairs windows. A car in the drive. A child's scooter on its side by the steps, in the wet. I remember thinking, they've been out today, they left the scooter out. That scooter had been placed there. I am certain of it now. It was dry underneath. The woman who opened the door was about 40 and looked like the photograph, which I checked, because I always checked. She said, "Juno, oh, thank you so much, come in out of that." Her name, she said, was Elspeth. Her husband, in the hallway with his coat half on, was Rob. The house was warm and cluttered and smelled of cooking. There were shoes in a heap. There were drawings on the fridge with names on them in a child's handwriting. There was a school newsletter on the counter with the right school's name on it, and a dentist appointment card, and a wall calendar with things written on it in 2 different pens. And there were 2 children. Sofka, 6, in pajamas with dinosaurs, and Bay, 3, already asleep upstairs, and Sofka took my hand within about 90 seconds and told me about a girl at school called Marianne who was not being kind. I need you to hold on to that. There were children. Real ones. That is the thing nobody believes, and it is the thing that took me 4 years to stop having nightmares about. They left at 20 past 8. Anniversary dinner, then staying at a hotel in the city because of the drive. Back by 8 in the morning. Elspeth hugged me at the door, which was unusual but not alarming, and said, "You have no idea how much this means." I put Sofka down at 9. Bay did not wake. I sat downstairs with the television on low and my phone in my hand, and I was, for about 2 hours, completely content. The first thing was the drawings. I got up to make tea at around 11 and I stood in front of the fridge looking at them the way you do. 4 drawings. 2 signed Sofka, in wobbly capitals. 2 signed Bay. Bay was 3. And Bay's name was written in the same hand as Sofka's, with the same pressure and the same slightly backward Y. That's nothing. Children copy each other. An older sister writes her brother's name on his picture constantly. It is the single most ordinary thing in the world. But I had a cup of tea in my hand and nothing to do, so I looked at the 4th one more closely, and in the bottom corner, very faint, in pencil, someone had written a number. 14. I checked the others. 11, 12, 13. They were numbered. I stood in that kitchen for a long time. Then I did the thing that I have been told, by 2 therapists and 1 police officer, was the correct thing, and that I still cannot forgive myself for, because it is what made me sure, and being sure at 11 at night 40 minutes down the Kell Road was the worst possible outcome. I opened the kitchen drawer. The one everybody has, the one with the batteries and the string and the takeaway menus. And it was full. Genuinely full, of exactly the correct rubbish. But the takeaway menus were all from the same 3 places and all printed on the same paper stock and none of them were creased. I opened the fridge. There was food in it. Nothing was open. Every jar had its seal. I went into the downstairs cloakroom and there was a toothbrush pot with 3 toothbrushes in it and all 3 were dry and unsplayed. I went and stood in the hall. And I looked at the family photographs going up the stairs, 8 of them in frames, and in every single one, Elspeth and Rob and the 2 children were photographed outdoors, in different places, in different weather, and in every single one, the children's faces were slightly turned or slightly blurred or partly behind an adult's shoulder. 8 photographs. Not one clear face. The staging was extraordinary. I want to give it that. Somebody had built a family in that house, and they had built it well, and they had made exactly the mistakes you make when you are building rather than living, which is that you get the objects right and the where wrong. There is a particular quality to the moment when a room you have been comfortable in stops being that room. Nothing changes. The lamp is the same lamp. The heating is still on. And every single object in your field of vision quietly reassigns itself from furniture to evidence. The cushions on that sofa had no dent in them. I had been sitting on one for 3 hours and mine was the only one. The remote control for the television had a battery cover that was slightly loose, and when I picked it up out of pure nervous habit I saw that the rubber buttons had no shine on them at all. A family remote is polished by thumbs. That one was matte, all over, like something in a showroom. And on the wall by the door, at about 1 meter off the ground, there was a pencil chart of children's heights, with dates, going back 4 years. It was beautiful work. Somebody had done it in 4 different pencils to suggest different occasions. The lowest mark was dated when Bay would have been 11 months old, and it was at 91 centimeters, which is the height of a well-grown 2.5-year-old, and I only knew that because I had measured about 60 children in 5 years of this job and the number was simply wrong in my hands before it was wrong in my head. They got everything right except the things you can only know by doing it. I went upstairs. Sofka was asleep in a bed in a room with a border of rabbits. Bay was asleep in a cot in a room with a border of boats. They were real, and warm, and breathing, and they were the only 2 things in that entire house that were not a set dressing, and standing in that doorway at 20 past 11 I understood, in one drop, that I did not know who they were. I called the police at 11:34. I got through. I want to say that, because it matters to what came after. I got through to a call handler and I gave the address and I said I was a babysitter and I thought the house was fake and I thought the children might not belong to the people who had hired me. And she was calm and she took it seriously and she said units would attend. And then she said, "Can you stay on the line?" And I said yes. And she said, "Can you tell me if there's anyone else in the property?" I said no. She said, "I need you to check." I did not want to. I have never in my life wanted to do anything less. But I put the phone in my hoodie pocket on speaker and I went round that house, and it was empty, all of it, and when I got to the door at the end of the upstairs landing it was locked. Not bolted. Locked, with a key, from the outside, and the key was gone. I said that out loud to the phone. And there was a pause, and then the handler said, "Is there any sound from that room?" I put my ear against it. And somebody on the other side, very close, on the other side of an inch of hollow door, breathed out. I did not scream. I went down the stairs and I got both children out of their beds, and Bay woke up and was confused and heavy and Sofka woke up and was silent in a way that I understood immediately and that told me more than anything else in that house, and I carried them both out through the front door into the rain and put them in my car and drove. I drove about 2 miles and pulled into a farm gateway because I could not see, and I sat there with the engine running and 2 children in the back and I stayed on the phone with that woman for 19 minutes until the blue lights came down the Kell Road. The house was empty when they got there. Whoever had been behind that door was gone across the fields. Nobody was ever arrested. I need to say that plainly. The house was a holiday let, booked for 4 days by a card that traced to nothing. The app account had been created 11 days earlier and had a stolen ID and 41 reviews that had all been posted within a 9-hour window from 12 devices, which is a thing the platform's own fraud team could have caught in about 4 seconds and did not, because nobody was looking. The children were not related to each other. That was the worst morning. They were not siblings, they were not from the same city, and the 6-year-old was not called Sofka. She was returned. I am allowed to say that much and no more, and I have chosen for 8 years to say only that. She was returned, and so was he, and they are somewhere, and they are, as far as anyone has ever told me, all right. I did not get a medal or a headline. There was a short piece in a regional paper that got most of it wrong. What I got was this. 6 weeks later, my account on that app was closed for a terms of service violation, specifically for removing children from a booked address without parental consent. It was reinstated 4 months afterward with an apology that ran to 2 paragraphs and used the word oversight. I never used it again. I never sat for anyone again. 8 years, and I have not been alone with somebody else's child since, and I understand exactly what that costs me and I have made my peace with paying it. And here is the thing I actually want to leave you with, because it isn't the door and it isn't the breath. It's the reviews. 41 of them, posted in 9 hours by 12 devices, and I read 11 before I took that job. And they were good. They were warm and specific and slightly rambling. One of them mentioned that Elspeth always leaves a plate of something out for you. One mentioned that the little one goes down easy but the older one will negotiate. One said, honestly one of the nicest families on here, you'll feel at home straight away. Somebody wrote those. A person sat down and wrote 41 small warm lies about a family that did not exist, and every one of them was pitched perfectly at somebody exactly like me. They didn't hack anything. They didn't force anything. They studied what makes a 26-year-old with 11,000 in debt feel safe, and then they built it, out of takeaway menus and a scooter left out in the rain and a wall calendar with 2 different pens. That's what I check for now, in everything, in every part of my life. Not danger. Danger is easy, danger looks like danger. I check for the version of things that has been assembled for me. The too good rate. The warmth that arrives too early. The typo in the message that made me trust it, which I now think about more than anything else in that house, because a person put that there. Somebody sat at a keyboard and made a small deliberate mistake so that a stranger 40 minutes down a dark road would think, oh, they're only human. That's the whole trade. That's all it ever is. They don't break in. Nobody breaks in anymore. You put on your coat, and you check the address, and you send it to your sister, and you drive out there yourself, in the rain, at 8 o'clock on a Saturday evening, and you knock on the door, and somebody opens it and says your name like they're glad, and you walk in. You always walk in. I did. And the terrible thing, the thing I have never once been able to reason my way out of in 8 years, is that if I had read those 41 reviews and thought better of it and stayed home that night, then somebody else would have taken the job. Somebody with a 4.9 instead of a 4.98. Somebody a little more tired, a little further into their overdraft, a little less likely to open a kitchen drawer at 11 at night out of pure idle boredom. And those 2 children would have slept through it. So I don't regret going. That's the thing that keeps me awake. I have never once regretted going, and I will never sit for anyone again, and I hold both of those at the same time every single night, and I have stopped expecting them to resolve. My sister asked me once, years afterward, what I would tell someone starting out on those apps. She meant it kindly. She wanted a list. And I sat with it for a long time, and in the end all I had was this. Trust the small wrong thing. Not the big one. The big one will always have an answer ready, because somebody prepared it. The small one is the one nobody thought to rehearse, and it will feel far too trivial to act on, and that feeling is precisely the mechanism by which it works. Act on it anyway. Be the person who leaves over a drawer full of uncreased menus. Be ridiculous. Be wrong 99 times. The scooter was dry underneath. That's what I dream about. Not the door. Not the breathing. A child's scooter lying on its side in the rain, put there by an adult, an hour before I arrived, so that a stranger walking up a gravel drive in the dark would look at it and think, ah. Children live here.